I'm Nicola Benson. I'm the managing editor of the Sociological Review, and I'm joined today from my left to right by Emma Jackson, who is the editor with a digital portfolio. Bev Skeggs, our previous editor and editor-at-large at the Journal. Marie-Andre Jacob, who is also general editor, and Greg Martin, who is the special issues editor, among other things. We're unfortunately not joined today by Tom Slater, who has sprained his ankle and is unable to make it. And I should also mention the other member of our editorial team, Steve Brown, who's responsible for all the amazing monographs that you will see out there on the desk, including that Sociology of Stigma monograph, and the other new one, which is called Unboxing the Sharing Economy. As Jenny said, plug for the Stigma monograph. This is your last chance. They're £10. It's really good value. Steve will be joining us from tomorrow, so you'll have a chance to hear from him at the Stigma monograph launch. So, right. I thought I would just start by telling you a little bit about how we're going to run this opening keynote. We're going to have a conversation. As you'll see, we've gone very lo-fi. There'll be no PowerPoint. We're just going to have a chat between the five of us about what we've been trying to do at the Sociological Review and what we want to do with the conference. The idea behind the conference is to do a conference differently. I hope that we get that right in some ways. We'll see. This is a bit of an experiment in lots of ways. I've seen this conference described variously in the social media rounds as a festival of sociology. I would go one step further with that and say that this is a celebration of the sociological and a reimagining of what the sociological could be. And there is a really exciting programme that includes a wide range of keynotes and discussions on issues of contemporary importance, sociological films in the cinema, an exhibition in the Cube space over there, and sessions on topics as wide-ranging as making your own sociological board game. That seems to be the one that lots of people have captured the imagination of, and podcasting your PhD. It is also a relaunch of the journal. It's taken us a few years to get to this stage since we started working, well actually I say we, but since Bev and the previous editors started working on really thinking about what the Sociological Review could be beyond the journal. And this conference is the logical progression of that project, I would say. It also marks the move of the journal from Wiley Blackwell to Sage, which took place at the beginning of last year. And it's also a way of introducing you to our exciting editorial team. I would say that. That's obviously me and the whole team. So thank you very much for joining us. And I hope that you feel that you're welcome here and that you can engage in the discussions that we're having. For those of you who don't know very much about the Sociological Review, which might be some of you, I just thought I would start off by just saying a few words about the history of the journal. The other thing that was going through my head when I thought about the idea of doing a conference was the fact that this journal is 110 years old this year. So the journal was officially launched in 1908. It was preceded by a set of sociological papers from the Sociological Society for the previous 4 years. And this makes us the oldest journal in Britain that deals in the sociological. And I'm using sociological specifically there instead of sociology. I think that officially our branding says that we're the oldest journal of sociology. But I think that this is quite curious in the context of a conference on undisciplining, when you realise that sociology wasn't a thing in 1908. So I really want to reclaim the sociological today, rather than sociology, in welcoming you all to this space. Because I think that the sociological is really what closely accords with our ambitions for the conference. And in light of the history of the journal, which has historically had an openness to the sociological that's never been disciplined, I thought that that was quite an appropriate point to orient the conference around. So early papers in the journal included a paper by H.G. Wells, for example, who I don't think anyone could mistake for a sociologist, as we might think of them today. I think it's also important within the context of the conference to remember that sociology doesn't actually have a monopoly on the sociological. And I think that becomes very, very clear in who our constituent readers are. We have readers from a wide range of social science disciplines, but also beyond the journal, in our digital work, we have readers who might not have anything to do with the institutionalization of social science disciplines. So, yesterday at the ECR Day, I said that we were sociology before there was sociology. And I want to amend that slightly. The Sociological Review was sociological before there was sociology. And this signals an attitude towards trying to understand the world rather than an inward concern about a bounded disciplinary identity. And this really does feed how we understand the intellectual project behind the journal and behind our foundation organisation, the Sociological Review Foundation Limited. It's behind the types of conversations that we're trying to curate in the pages of the journal, on the pages of the blog, and at the conference today, tomorrow, and Thursday. And that, I think, is really important. It's an intellectual project that extends beyond the paywalled pages of the journal and into our amazing digital platform curated by Mark Carrigan and Emma Jackson. So I think thinking about the sociological helps us to think about where the sociological as a political project is located and how that leads us to seek the sociological outside the walls of the academy. It also allows us to question who has sociological knowledge and how that might be reshaped. So I'm very, very pleased that we're able to welcome people here today who might not be working in universities, in institutions, but work very, very sociologically outside the walls of the academy. And I was very excited again, and I will hand over the mic to somebody else in a minute, but I was really inspired yesterday to see how the early career researchers who came along to the ECR pre-conference are mobilising and reimagining the sociological with an energy and fervour that's really, really inspiring, who are just doing the sociological in their everyday lives. So, before I move over to ask Bev a few questions about her reimagining of this space and this journal, I wanted to just say that sociology doesn't have a monopoly on the sociological. And the question that orients our actions as a journal, as a foundation, as a conference, is not one that looks on that well-trodden path of what is sociology, or that self-investigative question of who is a sociologist, but actually, what can the sociological be and do? And thinking really, I think, with the public dimensions of sociology. So I think that's quite a good time to bring in Bev. Bev, for those of you who are not familiar with her work for the journal, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her in other contexts, was really instrumental in getting us to this stage. And one of the early things that she did when she came on as the managing editor of the journal was to write a manifesto. So I wanted to start by asking you why you thought we needed a manifesto.
I think everybody needs a manifesto. Welcome. This is, for me, a delight. Before I go to your question, this is the culmination, partly, of the manifesto and all the work we put into changing the journal from 2011 onwards. I thought we needed a manifesto because we'd just been in a massive crisis. We're still in it. We're still living the consequences of it from the financial crash in 2007 and 8. And the world was kind of rapidly changing in front of us, but the journal remained the same. It's like we need to change it. We need to have a journal that actually speaks to what's going on in the world. And it was precisely what you say, Mikola. It was about I felt we needed to use our sociological knowledge to attack what was going on, to speak to austerity, to challenge austerity, to challenge the horrors that were going on across the world. And I felt, what's the point in actually managing a journal if it's just going to be about the same old, same old? So I wanted to use it to make interventions. I wanted to use it to do something quite different. And I think this is it, really. I mean, this is a culmination. And we had to spend a lot of time doing things I'm not very good at, but Attila over there is an absolute genius at. And so just a little bit of the history to say how we got here. In 2011, Mike Savage, myself and Attila started kind of going through the infrastructures. Never underestimate the importance of an infrastructure. But since 1908, the journal had been amassing money through publications, obviously through selling things, but it just like stayed there. And nobody was really cognizant of it or worried about it. And we thought, what should we do with this? Now, when you suddenly find that amount of money, it's quite bewildering. So, because you want to put it to the best use, but if you have absolutely no financial knowledge of investments or anything, actually, because most of us work in universities where we inherit structures. We don't make those structures. But Attila, Mike Savage and I got to work on making structures, legal structures, financial structures, HR structures, everything that you really wouldn't want to do if you're trying to change the world. But I think what you learn is you need those very stable structures in order to enable anything to happen. So I say we were lost in the amass of legality for many, many years, a lot of years. And without Attila, none of this would have been possible. He was quite amazing, is still amazing. I hate that word quite, it's a British qualifier. It's not quite, he was absolutely incredible at enabling this to happen. So I began with the enthusiasm of a Cocker Spaniel, writing a manifesto, the spectres haunting Europe, we will change it, and then got absolutely sucked into all the kind of the space of finance, legality, and organisational structures. So it was very sociological. I learned a lot. I'm still learning, actually, in terms of finance. So what we did was create a dual structure. We had the journal, which kind of did have, we got a nearly completely new board, kind of tried to re-energise everything, tried to bring on ECRs, tried to kind of give it the structure that fitted the manifesto. And I do feel you've achieved that. I think it's there. So we're really getting there now. The ECR day yesterday was really important in that sense, like bringing on those who are actually making the challenges rather than, I'd say, us old dogs who are just making the structures now. So the people who are doing the big challenges are really important. But to do that, we then set up the charity. We set up the foundation so that we could actually spend the money. So we now transfer all the money from the journal into the foundation and spend all that money, and we're literally spending it down. So this conference is a spend down. A lot of the ECR activities, the writing retreats and everything else that you spent ages putting together over the last 5 years have been amazing. All the different work that you've done. It's actually been using that money to very productive uses that should generate a new challenge, a new sociological challenge to what's going on. So for me, we wrote the manifesto. In the end, it became a joint product between Roland Munro, who was the editor with me initially, Sarah Green, and Mike Michael. And so we wrote that manifesto, and I still think it's important, but I'd be really interested to find out whether other people still think it's significant, because it was written a long while ago, modified, I think, more recently, but it is an oldish manifesto. But I still feel the challenges are still there. I feel this conference has kind of enabled things to happen. But we also did really complex things that you may have all suffered from. We decided we didn't want to pay a corporate manuscript central organisation £300,000 for a submission system. We wanted our own disaster. Disaster. If anybody, never build a submission system. Just really don't even go there. We're having to have it rebuilt now, and that was difficult. And so huge apologies to all of you who have had to suffer the submission system, especially to all the editors who've really had to suffer this. Yeah, I know. Who are still suffering from the glitches in the submission system. If you ever think of doing that, never. Don't even go there. That's like ridiculous. But the great success is call out to Mark Harrigan here and Marcus Gilroy Ware, who set up the social media channels and the website, which have proved to be, I think, remarkable. They are the complete reinvigoration of what we wanted to see. They enable sociology to make interventions, to be public. We want you to be involved in all the kind of points that are being made about what's going on in the world. So that's why we had a manifesto.
I think that's answered all 4 of the questions that I actually had on my piece of paper. I suppose the only kind of clarification.
Okay.
Why do you think the sociological is important?
I think it's a form of knowledge. So it's an explanation. So if we talk about sociological theory is just an explanation. So it's an explanation of what's going on in the world that can see the social relationships that manifest. So I think it's impossible just to talk about capitalism as an economic system, for instance. It is a social system that generates social relationships, that enables people to connect to each other and produces the conditions of possibility by which we live. So for me, that is sociological. Everything that involves a social relationship is sociological, but we have to abstract it to understand how, to understand why, and to understand the consequences. Is that all right?
Yeah. The mic's with you now.
Oh, do you want me? Right, so now it's my role to ask the editors questions, right? So I wrote them down. I'm not doing text messages in the middle of a session. So we thought... When I took over the journal, I liked it because it was quirky. I always thought of it as a quirky journal. You could see bizarre things published in it previously that you'd never find anywhere else. So for me, it's always been that kind of outlier, hopefully a bit edgy. Did have some very strange things in it historically. Still has, actually. But like working at the edges of sociology. So I want to ask each of you in turn, what does the manifesto mean to you now, and how are you engaging with it? And how would you like to take it forward? So I'll go round. I'll go from Greg to Marie-Andre.
Okay.
Well, that's
I can take that as well if you want. Hello, everyone. I've come all the way from Australia, so I'm actually just about over my jet lag. I think there's a sort of practical dimension as an editor of about engaging with the manifesto, using it as a sort of template, or template's probably too strong a word, a sort of guide, I suppose, as to sifting through submissions and things like that. So some of the things that I would be looking at in terms of, right at the sort of from the outset would be responding to that sort of quirky edginess, which I think is correct as well. You know, that's always something that I've considered to be a quality of the sociological review. Thinking about novel ideas and concepts. You know, is there a sort of novel idea or a novel concept in the paper, for example, that kind of leaps out at you? So that's one thing that I would be looking for in terms of engaging with the manifesto as an editor and somebody who's looking at reviews. There's also a sort of more of an instinctual side to it as well. I think it's sort of the X Factor type sort of, it's like you kind of know in a way that the papers are sort of fit for the journal because you've engaged with the journal yourself. You've used the journal in your own research, and you've I don't actually like the sound of my own voice, so. So you've engaged with it in your own research, so you kind of have a sense and an instinct for what what kinds of things should be contained in there. I haven't memorised the manifesto.
Why not?
You'll be surprised to know. So I'm sort of flying by the seat of my pants here a little bit in terms of thinking about it in this respect. But the other thing I think that's mentioned in the manifesto is yes, looking at a sociological kind of having a sociological angle, and I think Mikola's idea there is a very useful one in terms of thinking about undisciplining and the relationship of the material in the journal to the discipline of sociology. But the other thing that's in there, I think, is this idea of a sort of an interdisciplinarity, and also something that comes out of a not wanting to have material contained in the journal that could be placed in a journal that is about the sociology of X or the sociology of Y. You know, it's a bit of a more generalist type of approach that I certainly would be looking for in submissions that would tally with what's in the manifesto. And the other things as well is, you know, I'm a special issues editor as well, so I mean, some of the things that I've tried to build into that process has been, again, engaging with the manifesto in terms of, you know, trying to, in those submissions, have a sort of mix or blend of ECRs, MCRs, and more senior academics. I think that's in the manifesto, I can't remember. So there's that as well, and also that sort of, I don't really like the word interdisciplinarity, partly because I'm working in an institution that's obsessed with the term. But certainly a sort of a global kind of perspective and a sort of beyond discipline kind of perspective as well. And also, you know, again, sort of to engage with the manifesto, I'm just thinking about submissions that have come in, you know, things that use photography and imagery and the visual, you know, things that are constitute a sort of provocative, almost polemic sort of type of engagement with an area or around a concept or something like that. So those are the kinds of things, just thinking off the top of my head about how I would engage with the manifesto as a reviewer. Yeah, is that okay?
Thank you. What about Marie-Andre?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think you really set the scene right. As a reviewer and as an editor, really, the manifesto, again, I didn't memorize it, I'm sorry. But there are some words there that really are printed in there and make their mark, and they become my own manifesto as an editor. One thing, it's not papers that don't take their objects for granted, and it sounds a cliche, but it's really certain objects and subjects tend to attract a certain perspective. So when you see a paper that comes at its subject from, and when you anticipate, because there's a body of literature that come to the subject with a perspective, and then someone takes it at another angle. This is really something that, as an editor, I feel that it's a work that serves the manifesto when the objects are not taken for granted, and it's so important. It makes such a difference when you see a paper like that. And again, when I say coming at an object from an unanticipated perspective, I mean the combination of unlikely pairings, really. Which sometimes can surprise. So I want to be careful. We love to be surprised, and I think there's something in the manifesto that elicits the surprise of the sociological. But at the same time, it can be a trap, right? You don't want, the manifesto is not a surprise for the sake of surprise. But really, when people, they come at you and you don't anticipate them to come from this angle, I think, and some journals that we see ourselves, I think it's mentioned in the manifesto, some journal like Economy and Society, for example, we see us as our cousins, perhaps our cousin journal. But I was reading a paper recently in that journal. I just use it as an example, and it was a paper about the qualifying period in order to be eligible for a leave, for maternity leave. So a very technical, very legalistic, you could say, well, a boring, very boring subject. But it was a lovely paper using ethnographic work, interview, work with legislative writer. And it was really, so I think there's no object is boring. And again, I've heard about legality being boring here. I think legality has a bad press. Sorry?
You would say that.
I would not. No, I think we like papers that come from the edges. I mean, the theme of the conference is conversation from the edges. I think I'm the edges in this journal. The fact that given the manifesto, I'm one of the editor, and I come, to have a socio-legal / ethnographer / law and medicine person as an editor really speaks of the ethos of the manifesto, of really seeing the disciplines as important. I mean, they are a home, and they put constraints on us, which is very good. I think constraints are good, but they are not all-encompassing. And I think the manifesto really calls for work that can be between the spaces sometimes of the disciplines. Not only just bringing disciplines together, but I think when you feel when we feel that our work is not clearly disciplinarily located, that's okay. And I think there needs to be an outlet for work that acknowledges that disciplines, are not just all-encompassing. So these are just things that for how the manifesto speaks to me. There was perhaps another thing I wanted to say, and the imagination. Again, I think imagination is really the sociological imagination, but not just the sociological imagination. In order to see, to make visible what is invisible, or to look for what is at the risk of being forgotten or ignored, or what is under threat, you need imagination. So I think the manifesto is really an appeal for unleashing the imagination. That's for me how the manifesto speaks to me.
Great.
Michaela?
Well, I love a manifesto, so I was very delighted to be asked to be an editor of a journal with a manifesto, and one that's so good. For me, I think, again, haven't memorised it, but for me, I might not have memorised it, but I think I can carry it as a spirit. And for me, the manifesto is about a commitment to lively, engaged sociology, politically engaged sociology that can speak to the times that we're in. And for me, that goes beyond the journal. I think the other two editors have done a really good job of saying what we look for in papers. So for me, this goes way beyond the journal. It's something we're trying to foster on the digital platform, so through the blog, on social media, trying to push the conversations that we're having outwards and to bring people in to our conversations. I think there's a risk of us sounding really smug about how exceptional our journal is and how quirky we are and things, and I don't want that to be the case, because sometimes we fall flat on our face, and trying to do things a bit differently doesn't always work. And that might happen at this event as well. So I don't want to sound like, we've got it sussed, we're so quirky, we're just doing things, we're crazy guys. I don't want to sound like that at all. We are trying to do things differently, but it doesn't always work, and that's important, I think, to acknowledge that. We've tried a few things, and it's like, oh, well, let's not put the effort in to that particular media. But we are committed to trying things out, to pushing where sociology is at, and at the same time, we've not wanted to be smug. I think we are, we're having a good go at doing that, and changing some of where the conversations in sociology are taking place. But I think there's still a lot more to do in that, in terms of who we're speaking to and who's part of our conversations.
Okay, Nicola?
Yeah, so I think that my my intervention here speaks to the need to unpack what that quirkiness is, because I remember applying for the Sociological Review Fellowship in 2007. I was a fellow in the journal at that time. I didn't know anything about the Sociological Review at that time. This goes against all of the advice I gave yesterday to people on applying for jobs, by the way. And through that engagement and through being a fellow at the journal, I got to know the journal, and people would say, oh yeah, that's the quirky one, that's the one. And my first paper was in the Sociological Review as well. And I don't think that that's a surprise. So my own background is that I have a PhD in sociology and social anthropology, which has led to me being labelled as the anthropologist repeatedly over the course of my career, a label that I have found very uncomfortable for various reasons. And at various points, I've tried to claim myself as a sociologist. I think I'm going to stop doing that now, for various reasons, because I actually think that in itself, as a label, is not exactly reflective of who I am and the type of project that I want to engage with, which is much more about those intersections in knowledge, cutting across those different things. So that question that we ask it's not a question that we ask on our T-shirt. It's a statement. This is what a sociologist looks like, which I think, a sociologist can look like all sorts of things. But that question, is this what a sociologist looks like, or is this what sociology looks like, is one that I have been following very closely from a personal point of view, as well as thinking about very, very closely in respect to the journal and the work that we want the foundation to do. And I think that at times I've been asked to discipline myself in a way that our manifesto doesn't advocate. Our manifesto does not advocate the disciplining and the shutting down of sociological knowledge into particular forms of boxes. It opens up that box and takes steps towards changing the shape of sociology. And I think our subtext of our banner, which is not actually, is over there. So it now says shaping sociology, but I think originally the banner said something like shaping the nature of sociology or something like that. And I think that process, that construction, that constant reformation of what the sociological could do is what the manifesto says to me. And that's the thing that I hope as a sociological thinker I do, and that I hope that as a journal and as a foundation we encourage. So that's how the manifesto speaks to me.
Great, okay. You started to answer what does a sociologist look like. But it is quite interesting because sociology must be one of the most Catholic open disciplines in itself. I don't think I've ever been in a department full of sociologists. They're usually geographers, criminologists, legal theorists, a lot of anthropologists. And you've got to remember, I think Ronnie Frankenberg was editor for, 15 years, who is one of probably the most significant anthropologists in the UK. So we've had a lot of mixture of various different people. I think we're getting more cultural studies type papers more recently, I've noticed, which is interesting. And certainly, I think we're feminist. I think that's really, really important. There is a history where I think the first feminist article appeared in 1984 in the BJS, but Sociological Review under Ronnie Frankenberg published more feminist articles than any other journal. So I think that's a very important history, making space for different ideas. We're now trying to get lots more articles around issues around race, which has been more difficult, I think, than feminism, because as more women have entered the sociological, anthropological, legal, geography, all the different disciplines, we are getting much more feminist presence. But I think it's going to be more of a fight. So we want to keep opening out. We want to not keep closing down. That was part of the manifesto that I'm very disappointed that you haven't got it written on your hands and you haven't learned it. But it was meant to be about openness and challenge and intervention. We had all these words like stretching and pushing. It sounded like a maternity at one point, but we put it down. But one of the most important things was an ethos of engagement. So for me, that was one of the most important things, and thinking differently. There's always contradictions built into things. So we love the visual, But if you print the visual, it costs a fortune.
And you've got to get permission to print it
Yeah,
as well,
yeah, exactly.
which
And
is
it's like,
a nightmare.
I remember it being £250 for one visual. So imagine if you wanted 8 in an article, that's seriously expensive to do. So then the website becomes much more significant. And I think that's why the website's very important, because it's produced a space that is less constrained than journal articles. So for me, the website has been intervening really significantly, and building the link between the journal and the website has been very important. So Emma, as the digital editor, can you talk a bit more about what you've been doing there with Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I should say all of the digital activity started happening a long time before I came on board, and then I came along to try and get an extra pair of hands, and also to build links between the journal and the website. I think something that can be really frustrating about academic publishing, which many of you will have experienced, is the speed. So you want to write this groundbreaking article about austerity or something that's happening now that's really timely, and you want to get your thoughts out there. But to go through peer review, to wait, to get the reviews back, to go back through peer review, and there's a reason why we do that, and there's a place for that. But there also needs to be a place where sociologists can respond to things quickly, and can be relevant. So we've run specials on, one of our biggest specials is on the US election, where we generated tons of blogs of people reflecting from different positions on the US elections, with also some more less topical things, but where people can reflect on the challenges of academic life, so that the academic diary feature, and then also not just being a platform projecting outwards, but joining in conversations, circulating other people's articles, so a lot of that happens through the Twitter, that Mark's put a lot of work into developing that. This is going to be really, can I talk about this at the conference now? Yeah. Is that all right? We're really, really keen for, and people are already doing it. I was following the ECR day on the train yesterday. It was really great to be able to do that. So we're really keen for people to use this conference as a way of experimenting with the digital, but also sharing on social media. We have produced social media guidelines, which I'll be interested to know what you make of those. It's not supposed to be a dictatorial move. All we want you to really do is to reflect a bit on how and why you use social media. Certainly through our conversations about how we use social media and why, and we had an event in December that was wonderful on social media and sociology, prospects and problems, which I think we all came out of it going, I'm never going to tweet again, having thought about it. It's too scary. So we just asked people to think about why are you tweeting? Are you communicating outwards to people who can't be here? Are you interpreting what's going on? So we just want to raise those questions. There's also a really interesting live blogging experiment that's going on today and over the next few days, which is being run by Mark and by Pat Thompson. And they have 11 live bloggers who are going to be feeding back on the conference as it unfolds. And this is about communicating what's happening outwards, but also we want this to feed back into what's happening in the conference itself. So from reading the blogs from yesterday, they've sort of made me think about today and how we want to run the day. So I'd encourage you to engage with those, have a look, bring thoughts from those into your sessions. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying we are trying to experiment with the digital at the Sociological Review and push things forward a bit.
Great, thank you. So that was the digital. I'm going to pass over to Greg now, who I'm going to ask about sociology, or whatever it is, from the edges. So the Antipodean experience of, does it make a difference as an editor who's in Australia?
Yes, in terms of the time zone. I tend to work 24/7, but I suppose that's not a kind of unusual thing these days for academics. But yeah, there is that sort of practical element of trying to, you get up in the morning and it's still, sort of early evening for you guys and vice versa. So there's a practical dimension to that. Yeah, that's sort of, I mean, in terms of the actual, I mean, I'm from the UK originally, so I have a slightly different take on it, I guess, in that sense. In terms of sort of papers and things coming in, I wouldn't say that it has any kind of effect. Do you want me to talk about sociology in Australia, or?
Well, what's the difference? What does it make any difference being in Australia?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, there's also my sort of reflections on Australian sociology are very much what you guys have said already. I think Nicola and Bev is that my department, for example, is actually a sort of melange of all sorts of different types of people with different types of backgrounds. You know, I have a sort of socio-legal and criminology background as well as a sociology background, and we've got criminologists. Probably not so much anthropology because we have a separate department. So there's a very great sort of mix of people. My feeling about Australian sociology, if there is such a thing, is that it's not quite as distinctive and doesn't have quite the character that, say, a British sort of form of sociology might have. My understanding, and it's quite limited, is that partly has to do with cultural studies having taken root a lot more than sociology in the 60s and 70s. So it's very much, unlike the UK, very much more in its infancy as a discipline, I think, although there is a Australian Sociological Association. But a lot of my work, if I'm thinking about it in terms of my own work, which again is not always sociological actually, so I would struggle to call myself a sociologist as well, having got a PhD in sociology, but then subsequently specialised in law and criminology. So, but my work, I always try to infuse a sort of Australian angle or an Australian example if I can. And some of my more legally based work is Australian by its nature, because legal stuff is jurisdictionally bound, isn't it? Or it tends to be. Sorry. It's an interesting experience. I do feel in some respects sort of isolated. There is a sort of degree of isolation that you feel. Partly that's because of the time zone thing. But also, you know, you come here and you sort of have a sense of there is a sort of a huge array of disciplines here, whereas in Australia there's like 6 or 7, you know, and they're separated by huge distances. So there's a lot of differences, yeah, for sure, about working around the edge. There's also in Australia, just to mention this as well, which I think is probably quite important, is this idea of Southern theory, which I'm not sure who in the audience would be familiar with that, but this idea that particularly in Australia, there's sort of attempt to incorporate into any kind of sociological analysis a sense of the history of colonialism and issues to do with Aboriginal communities and things like that. It doesn't necessarily relate to the work that I do, but I know that that's certainly a movement, if you like, in Australian sociology, as Australian sociologies work within the Global South, although the Global South itself is obviously a contested sort of idea.
I'm just going to pass over to Emma now to talk about one of the things that's really been important about this conference is where it is. So Emma, why here?
Well, we decided we'd find out what was the best region of the UK. No. I think that having the conference at the Baltic was Jenny's idea. She floated the idea of the Baltic. I think it's important for us to do something outside of London. I think so much of UK sociology sort of pivots around London, and it's great to be somewhere else. But once Jenny, mentioned the idea of the Baltic, we were so excited about it because it allows us to shake things up in a couple of different ways. So it makes possible having a cinema, running a whole stream of not academic films, that sounds awful, of films that are related to sociology. There's an exhibition space, so we're not trying to shoehorn these kinds of formats into a university in a way that can feel really awkward. So it opens up what is possible, and then once we put out the call for papers, people took that off in directions we couldn't have foreseen. Movement workshops, stand-up comedy, all kinds of things are going to happen that are really exciting. This, of course, brings with it challenges. And to feedback on Mark's first blog from yesterday, he was writing about how once you shake things up from the normal, 420-minute conference presentations format, you get all of these new things to think about. How are we going to get the pictures on the wall? Oh no, the film files are massive. Things like this. So it brings up these other things that you have to think about. So it's been, quite hard work to organise. The other thing about moving from academic space that I was really excited about and we were excited about is shaking up conversations and hierarchies. So we all know, if you work in a university, we're quite used to occupying academic space in various ways. This is actually more terrifying for me than being in a university. I feel like I should be given some sort of motivational TED talk or something in this setting. But I hope that by moving out of the space of the university, we can shake up the kinds of conversations that happen as well as the formats. So shake up the power relations in the room, perhaps. We really want this to be a friendly space. That's part of undisciplining the space. Another thing from Mark's blog was that he reflected that sometimes conferences can feel really cliquey, and then if they don't feel cliquey, it can be because you're in the clique. So I'd really, much as this is a great opportunity to see your friends and things like that, do be open to chatting to people and be mindful of including people in your conversations, I would say. And we'd also just like to foster an atmosphere where people feel able to speak, to participate, but are also mindful of the space that they take up in the room. So I should probably stop at that point.
No, that's great, because that's the manifesto, the ethos. We want an ethos that is open to challenge and open to different conversations. I'm just going to ask Michaela, what are the current challenges she faces as the managing editor, and then I'll open it out to the audience. So Michaela, challenges.
Well, I'm pretty certain that we've covered most of them, because the challenges that you faced in setting up the infrastructure also continue. So, there are lots of things that go on behind the scenes of the journal and the foundation that people will never see. As long as things are running smoothly, it's when things don't run smoothly that those things become visible. So there are numerous challenges, and I think Emma's also pointed to some of the challenges of organising a conference that's designed to be different and learning constantly, and I'm sure that Jenny would sympathise with this, learning constantly what the constraints are on being able to do that. But I also think that in focusing too much on the challenges, we might forget about the opportunities and the excitement that comes with that. And we want to take people along with us in that excitement and in thinking about those opportunities, which is one of the reasons why we have such a prominent ECR initiative, for example, which certainly, as the person who originally instigated that initiative, I can say that wasn't always smooth running either. So we can always do better and learn more, and I think that's probably what I would say about those opportunities. We want people to be involved in those conversations about how we extend the sociological in all sorts of different directions.